那么青白瓷与青花瓷到底具体有什么样的关系呢？
Hello, and welcome to this podcast, My Stories of Chinese Porcelain. I am Tu Rui Ming, a craftsman and writer on Chinese porcelain based in Jingdezhen, China, known as the porcelain capital. Also called Chinese ceramics, porcelain's origins come from China. It is one of humanity's most ancient inventions, and I am fascinated as to how my ancestors created these timeless masterpieces and how this unique and exquisite material made its way to all corners of the world, even giving the modern world the word China. Last year I took some photos of porcelain at the Shanghai Museum. I recalled a little boy of around 10 years old walking into the ceramics hall and seeing a large bottle in front of him. He suddenly exclaimed to his father, "Daddy, look, such a big jade!" His father smiled as soon as he heard this, telling the boy, "Silly child, this is not jade, it is porcelain." After seeing this exchange, I understood that the father's recognition of the porcelain vase was because he was aware they were at a ceramics museum. However, I was also able to side with the little boy's initial reaction. The big bottle he had observed had been made of a unique type of porcelain known as Rao jade during the Tang and Sung dynasties. Here the term Rao also symbolizes the rich and powerful. If this work were not placed in a ceramics museum, one would not necessarily be able to tell if it were jade or porcelain. So let us ask, what is Rao jade porcelain? And how did it come to obtain the title of jade? This type of porcelain is a bluish white, slightly transparently white, with a moist glazed surface, much like blue and white jade. A long time ago, the porcelain had another name, fake jade. As time went on, people began to dissociate it with jade, and it gained the poetic name Yingqing, the shadow of shadows. Rao jade's formal name is bluish-white porcelain. The name is interesting, as ancient ceramics began to mature during the Tang dynasty. Back then, celadon and white porcelain were the most important forms of porcelain. At this time, celadon porcelain had a green, jade-like colour appearance. Up until the Sung dynasty, celadon and white porcelain were still the two most acknowledged categories of porcelain. However, bluish-white porcelain, or Qingbai porcelain, was able to combine the best of these two porcelains. To make a better sense of this statement, imagine purchasing a mobile phone. There are some phones that have high-performance standards, however, they're lacking in aesthetic value. A high-performance phone which is also aesthetically pleasing would be the most expensive. However, Qingbai was able to succeed in combining the advantages of celadon and white porcelain. Let us look at the advantages and disadvantages of celadon and white porcelain. For the sake of understanding my story, you can imagine them as two snakes. Firstly, let us observe the green snake, celadon. Celadon is the oldest type of porcelain. Today we regard the most primitive porcelain as celadon. There's a difference in the meaning of the word blue in the Chinese characters of celadon and blue and white porcelain. The blue of the blue and white porcelain is actually blue, whilst the blue in celadon refers to the green colour. Celadon is not a particular kind of porcelain, rather a certain family of porcelain. Celadon is the oldest porcelain in the history of ceramics. If we look at the history of porcelain as a process, we understand that celadon has undergone thousands of years of practice and transformation. It is the longest practiced porcelain in our world. Many famous ancient kilns were in fact producing celadon. Such examples include the famous Tang dynasty secret colour porcelain. It was in fact a blue-grey celadon. The Ru kiln, Royal Kiln and Gera kilns in the Sung dynasty were also making celadon. Even in the history of North Korea, there are stories of celadon being fired over a period of time which was of a quality comparable to Sung porcelain. Although all of these pieces were celadon, the context and hue are not the same, and in some instances they do differ greatly, just like there are many different variants of green snakes. For example, when describing the Ruwu kiln, the word cerulean blue is used, amongst others, to depict its quality. In Chinese, there are similar pronunciations for celadon and blue and white porcelain. We just need to understand that celadon often has green colour in it and is relatively lighter in blue than normal blue and white porcelain. In history, there's a kind of Longchuan celadon known as Meizi Qing, or plum green. Meizi is plum in Chinese, and Chinese people used to cook green plums in rice wine to add flavour and colour. That celadon name lets us associate the porcelain colour to those green plums we enjoy eating. A while later, even more delicate colours and names appeared as East Kiln Green, Bean Green, and Pink Green. Later in the Qing dynasty, due to the firing technology of making celadon becoming so mature, it was almost sophisticated enough to create whatever colour you desired. If you wanted, the celadon could be more blue or green or darker or lighter. Thus many shades of green and blue colours were produced, such as pink blue, a colour that was lighter than the traditional green celadon. Another characteristic of celadon is the glaze on its outside. It is often very moist and has the texture of jade. This may be related to its inherent texture in some ways, but also impacted by the craftsmanship. As we know, there are many types of celadon, and the glazed layers are relatively thick. There is also another explanation for the thick glazed layer on celadon, which is actually related to celadon's shortcomings. Yes, as the saying goes, even handsome men have shortcomings, and so celadon, having been practiced for thousands of years, also has its shortcomings. The celadon made before the Yuan dynasty had rich colours and was of a very high standard. However, there was always the problem that the porcelain body form or clay materials were not white. The so-called body form was the part of the porcelain under the glaze. Porcelain is mainly comprised of two parts, the body form and the glaze. Let's use this analogy. The glaze is a bit like skin, and the body form is the bones. Under the skin, the body of celadon has never been white. For example, Ruwu kiln is known as incense ash, symbolizing the color of ash burned by incense. Lanquais celadon is known as iron tire. You can imagine the color of iron. The glaze on celadon is colored, often translucent, but at times opaque, so the internal structure of the body is covered. This was actually due to restrictions in technology and raw materials at the time. Whether it was Ruwu or Lanquais kilns, it was difficult to fire white porcelain from the local, not-so-white clays. This creates the different colour and texture outside and inside the celadon. During the Ming and Qing dynasties, when the royal kilns were copying the products from the Ruwu kiln and the Lanquais kiln, they started to use pure white porcelain body forms. That meant, at the time, the porcelain makers realised the problem and thus tried the improvement. Therefore, celadon glaze is relatively thick to cover the porcelain due to the lack of whiteness of the inside. This was an attempt to cover up the not-so-beautiful internal side of the porcelain. What about the white porcelain in the north? The colour white has always been deeply admired by everyone, so when white porcelain production began, its popularity quickly accounted for half of the country's interest, with celadon taking the other half. The white in white porcelain differs from celadon. The blue of celadon is the colour of its glaze, so can be recognised as its skin colour. The white of white porcelain is actually the colour of the body form or carcass, and the glaze is indeed transparent. And so we commonly see the glaze of white porcelain being generally relatively thin. Compared to celadon, the texture is more like jade, and the surface is not glossy. White porcelain of the time was unable to reach pure whiteness before the Ming and Qing dynasties, and appeared slightly yellow, and thus it was easier to see it as ivory rather than jade. Despite their shortcomings, the advantages of celadon and white porcelain are complementary. From the Ming and Qing dynasties, bluish-white porcelain had been created and spread throughout the world, almost combining the advantages of Celadon porcelain and white porcelain. Just like two sides of a circle, each with their own strengths, they met at a moment in time, and driven together by destiny and huge enthusiasm, they gave birth to a completely new and fulfilling life for porcelain. Whilst this new bluish-white porcelain had the warmth of Celadon, it also had the texture of white porcelain. In some places the glaze was relatively thick and showed a faint turquoise. As such, future generations also gave it the reputable title of shadow green, or Yingqing. In fact, many scholars in modern times believe that bluish-white porcelain was the result of trying to fire northern white porcelain from the old Celadon kilns of the south. Therefore, judging from stories of Celadon and white porcelain, we must never despise either region in the future. Although bluish-white porcelain has been so highly praised, when we speak about the famous porcelain of the Sung dynasty, we always think first about the 5 famous kilns, and, interestingly, there are no bluish-white porcelain kilns among them. Why is this so? The first reason is that the talk of the 5 famous kilns is not reliable, insofar as these are more a popular saying in antiques. Although it's not completely unreasonable, it is misleading to believe this as the standard. For example, let us proclaim that the 5 famous kilns are of the highest ranking. The first is Chai Kiln, named after the surname of the emperor of the last generation of the 5 dynasties, 921 to 959 AD. The emperor is called Qizhong in the Hozhou dynasty, and his personal name is Chairong. However, no one in history has ever recorded or seen porcelain pieces from the Chai Kiln, and thus the Chai Kiln was removed from the researchers' list. So the legend of the 5 famous kilns does not portray the real condition of the porcelain industry at that moment in time. The second important reason is due to the huge production of bluish-white porcelain. Dubbed the rare and expensive over time, not enough special attention in the field of antique collection was given to the ordinary bluish-white porcelain. This begs the question, what is the status of bluish-white porcelain now? Let us travel back to AD 1004. Several major events had happened during that year. First and foremost, there was a battle between the northern Sung dynasty and the state of Liao, which is the nomadic ethnic group occupying the vast grassland in the northeast of China. The war ended peacefully, and the 2 opposing parties signed an agreement. This would later be known as the famous Chanyuan Treaty in history books. Chanyuan was an old city by then and located in Puyang City in Henan province in China. It was said of the signing of the Chanyuan Treaty that Liao had an additional requirement that the emperor donate porcelain produced in Chang'an town. So where is Chang'an town? The name Chang'an seems strange to many people, as many of us have never heard of it. However, after 1004 AD, the town had changed its name, and this new name would later on become very familiar to all. It was called Jingdezhen. Some of you may ask, why did Chang'an town change its name that year? It turns out that the Emperor Song, Zhensong, changed the name of his year to Jingde, meaning of good scenery and virtue. Emperors in the Song dynasty generally ruled for many years and were able to name many years, unlike the Ming and Qing dynasties where emperors were only allowed to announce and use one year's name. In the Qing dynasty, the famous emperors Yongzhong and Qianglong are examples of using only one year name. Since there are many year names used in the Song dynasty, the emperors in the Song dynasty were not referred to by the year names. That year, 1004 AD, the tribute porcelain that had been made in Chang'an town was loved dearly by Emperor Zong, and he proclaimed that all porcelain fired in Chang'an town would have the word Jingde written on the bottom of the porcelain. And thus Jingdezhen got its name. Shen is town in Chinese. The original name seems to have been forgotten, but it hasn't. It is just remembered in another way, harking back to the town where it was made, Chang'an, or, as it is converted into the European alphabet, China. The porcelain produced by Jingdezhen, which was so much loved by the emperor, is the bluish-white porcelain we use widely in modern days, also known as false jade. Bluish-white porcelain was not only loved by the emperor at the time, but also by the people. At the time, demand for bluish-white porcelain in Jingdezhen was so high that the surrounding areas began trying to replicate the art form. Not only did many areas in Jiangxi province fire white porcelain, but the surrounding 7 provinces around Jiangxi had kilns of bluish-white porcelain. We can only wonder at the immense popularity of bluish-white porcelain. The appearance of bluish-white porcelain was the result of progress within the porcelain industry at the time. The technology continued to improve, and the technical exchanges between the North and South were also expanding. Most importantly, the appearance of bluish-white porcelain at the time laid a very good foundation for the existence of blue and white porcelain in the Yuan dynasty. It can be understood that if there were no bluish-white porcelain, there would be no blue and white porcelain. We can even think of bluish-white porcelain as the grandfather of blue and white porcelain. This leaves us with further questions. What exactly is the relationship between bluish-white porcelain and blue and white porcelain? What happened to this popular family of porcelain in later times? I will share with you these stories a little later in the series. For now, thank you for listening to my podcast, My Stories of Chinese Porcelain. Please tune in to the next episode, where I will talk about why blue and white porcelain used to be the most popular of luxury items in Europe.
邀请你和我一起来探寻瓷器的前世今生。
This has been a China Plus podcast. Original Chinese reading was by Sanliang Zhongdu, with English translation by Graham Stevens. If you like the show, please give us a rating and subscribe to us wherever you listen. If you've got any questions or feedback, please feel free to contact us via email at podcast@cri.com.cn or on Twitter at #ChinaPlusPods.